So, beginnings. So in the early 80s, it was the golden age of the 8-bit home computer. Most of the computers we use nowadays, PCs and Macs, PCs around that time, very expensive, business focused, serious, businessy business. They were way too expensive for home users. And so we had a series of products that were known as the home computer. They were originally designed as, this is something to do your home accounting or maybe a recipes database and all that sort of stuff. Really what they got used for was games. Because the home computers of this age were pretty much the home game consoles of the time with a keyboard and a tape recorder attached, and you plugged them into your TV, and away you went. And because games, instead of being on cartridge like the old consoles did, were distributed on disc, and it meant that why would you need to go and buy a game if you could copy it off your friends at school? And so every playground everyone knew who to go to get the games and make copies. And so the game developers tried to combat this by introducing copy protection methods. And this was primarily based around formatting their disks in such a way to defeat the copying tools of the time. So what tended to happen was that people with a lot of smarts and a lot of time figured out that you could break or crack the copy protection. And thus enable the games to be distributed. And then over time, because there was quite a bit of prestige associated with this, you'd want your name on it. So they used to edit the game and put their initials into the high score table and all this sort of stuff. Or preface the game. When the game initially loaded, it would come up with the name of the person who cracked it. And this example is from 81, so it's not on the Commodore 64. This was on a game on the Apple II called Crunch, Crumble and Chomp, or something like that, saying that it had been broken by the pirate on that date. In 84, a group called the Berlin Cracking Service added an image of their city flag in front of their crack of the game Pitfall 2. And this is the first time that we've found that someone had put an image in the front. And this became known as a crack intro, or cracktro. So these developed over time and got more and more sophisticated. So here's some screenshots from 6 of them that I managed to dredge up. Some of these groups are still around today. Fairlight, for instance, in the bottom 2, left and middle. Not sure about the others. All of these were animated and had some sort of music or sound effects to go along with it. The prestige of a cracking group was partly associated with the sophistication of the intro. So what is a demo? So kind of to describe how this came about, because these were always associated with the cracking of a game and the releasing of it. During the late 80s, there was a bit of a sea change, and the authorities, like the FBI in the US and the equivalents in Europe, started really cracking down on game piracy. There was enough money in the industry for them to start seeing this as a fraud situation. And so the cops, etc., were starting to bust the copy parties that were, and pirates, and people sort of wantonly advertising the fact that they were breaking the law, even though they didn't see it as much of a crime themselves. And so what happened is that the people who were coding these fancy intros and sophisticated animations on these very limited machines decided that they could do that as a thing of itself. It didn't have to be associated with the piracy of the game. And they sort of broke off from the cracking scene and formed the demo scene. And the demo is that bit of computer-generated art, real-time graphics, music, and pixelated art, and release that as a production themselves and get prestige from that. So it's kind of hard to explain to someone who sort of asked, well, what is it? It's real time like a game, and it uses similar sort of rendering techniques to games, but it's not interactive. It's probably closest to a music video, but with a music video, the music is always the lead actor. It's always the thing. You're not talking about Beyonce's latest video, you're talking about Beyonce's latest single. Well, maybe, I don't know. So in a demo, it's kind of like a music video where the graphics and the animation is on an equal or greater footing than the music. So one of the main things about that sort of drove the development of the demos was trying to push the hardware to the limits and beyond the limits. The machines at the time, very low clock speeds, 1 megahertz clock for most of the computers of the 80s, and the graphics hardware was sort of evolved from consoles where it wasn't, hey, I want to set this pixel over here to this color, and I want to draw this picture here, and I want to draw some triangles and stuff. It was, you had to do some pretty crazy things with registers and assembly language to get anything like this to work. So there was a lot of prestige in trying into showing that you could do something that wasn't thought possible on the platform at the time. So in the late 80s, a new machine came out, again by Commodore, the makers of the C64, called the Amiga. And I apologize for any Amiga fans in the audience, is that I'm going to have to skip across this, which is a terrible crime on my part, because the Amiga was an amazing machine. Clock speed of its CPU was only 7 megahertz, so still very, very slow. I mean, we're pushing 4 gigahertz now. So what made the Amiga special was that it wasn't a CPU with a bunch of other stuff in the background. It was like a little collection of very powerful processors doing separate things. So they had, you could see the machine there. They had a graphical environment when IBM PCs were just the little C prompt in DOS. So these are well ahead of its time. They had a processor that managed the various types of memory in the machine. There was a processor that handled all the graphics and allowed you to do hardware sprites, and there was even a little processor inside that ran synchronized with the electron beam on the monitor. So you could do things based on where the monitor was currently drawing, and you could use it to do things like, I'm going to change the display resolution halfway down the screen. So you've got graphics on the top, text on the bottom, and every time the screen refreshed, it would change the resolution at the right point to give you effectively two monitors. It also had, when every other computer could do simple beats, it had a sound processor that could mix 4 channels of 8-bit sound in hardware, and that was, it opened up this machine for use in music production. So yeah, is Roddy here? Is he somewhere else? He's probably heard that I'm going to skip over the Amiga and decided not to come boycott. So the thing to remember about, or the thing to realise about demos, is that it was not a solitary affair. These things were made by teams, because it's very rare to find someone who is a great coder and a great musician and a great artist in one. I mean, there's certainly people out there who will do demos by themselves, but predominantly a team effort. The distribution back in the 80s was difficult. You had no internet. You had bulletin board systems, which is when your computer would dial up another computer and have a little conversation, and it would all be text-based and you could download files. But it was very... In Europe, so in the United States, for instance, BBSs were quite popular for this kind of thing. But in Europe, phone calls were expensive. It cost a lot of money, especially if you were going across international borders. A lot of the stuff was happening behind the Iron Curtain, and there was a lot of restrictions on sort of communication technology. So this became a social activity, and people would physically meet up and exchange the work that they've been working on. There was a lot done via the post. There's a classic thing where known as stamps back. You would post off a bunch of discs to people and say stamps back, and it was saying, when you send me stuff, chop out the stamp and I'll try and rub off the postmark and reuse it again. So the demo party was the main social event in the Demoscene calendar. This is where you get together and get mind-bendingly drunk and share the work that sharing the demos that you've been working on. Normally held over 2 or 3 days. Some people will even write their demos at the party or at least finish them off. And the last day is sort of reserved for the competitions, and this is where the demos are all shown on a big screen, massive sound system, depending on funding, and the popularity of the demos and the winners of the competition are always decided by popular vote. So there was no sort of judging panel saying, oh yeah, we think this one is better. Mainly a Northern European phenomenon. So the main demo parties are sort of in Finland, Germany, Sweden, Norway, there's some in Hungary, France, I don't know if the Italian scene, if there was a demo party there. I think there's a couple, but elsewhere, the US, not so much. There was a small scene in Australia, which I found some of the people who worked for us were a part of. Wayne in Melbourne was part of a Demoscene group. But it is starting to sort of spread around the world. And of course, you need to publicise these demo parties, and naturally the ads were demos themselves shown at another party. So it's sort of a viral marketing thing in a way. So this is a party called Assembly. This was just a photo though. This is in Helsinki in Finland in 2004, and basically everyone carts their computer down, works on their stuff. There's a saying at demo parties that the real party is outside. So everyone's outside around a bonfire getting trashed, and just sort of catching up with friends and all that sort of stuff. So this is where the rules and conventions around around what a demo is started to sort of get solidified. So it must be rendered in real time. These aren't pre-recorded videos. Yes, you can pre-record a video, but it can't compete against demos. It has to go into the animation category. It must be your own work. You can't use other people's work. You can't, using copyrighted music is very frowned upon. So it's really, it's showing what you can do. And it must be within the size limit of the category that you're entering. So these things are often size limited to give, a sense of challenge. Common size limitations are 64 kilobytes, so that means you're writing a program and the executable is 64 kilobytes and that's all you've got. There's another category called 4K, 1K, and it goes down the chain, and I think the smallest ones are like 32 bytes. But there's a very small amount of stuff you can do in that amount of data. And it should be a combination of good code, good graphics, good music. And the thing that ties it together is sort of style and direction. And a common thing that you'll also see is greetings. So there will be a section of the demo devoted to shouting out to other groups that you respect or know. So in the early 90s, the IBM PC was being cloned by lots of other third parties, and the prices came down. Previously only being able to be afforded by businesses, they were now being bought as home computers. Not designed for gaming though, hopeless for demos. The graphics at the time were like 4 colours, you could choose, black, white, cyan and magenta. It was like, the hell can you do with that? But graphics were getting better. VGA came out, which allowed you to do 256 colours. You had third-party cards like the Sound Blaster that gave you digitised audio. And so suddenly the PC was a gaming platform, and that started to get the attention of the demo scene. So in the early days, we're talking early 90s, this is sort of like 91, 92 sort of era. So the graphics chipsets that you had, they suddenly had enough memory to display arbitrary graphics and not need all the hardware tricks. So they weren't as hackable, and the demo programmers couldn't use all the little hardware exploitation hacks that they were doing. So they had to sort of they end up basically making their own 3D engines. As 3D at the time was the thing. It was kind of like the excitement around VR now. It was like, this is going to be the future. Everything's going to look like that, with its flat shaded polygons. And 3D at the time was hard. You know the difference between integer math and floating point math. At the time, computers, a lot of machines around that time could not do floating point in hardware. So you could do it in software, but it was incredibly slow. So a lot of the challenge around this was to be able to do the floating point heavy 3D rotations and perspective transforms in a way that is fast enough to drive fluid 60 frame per second animation. And so a lot of demos at the time were just a sequence of, look at this object has 50 faces in it, and then the next production would come out and it's like, you thought 50 was good, now here's 60. And it was sort of just everyone trying to one up the last group. So as these machines got more powerful, the techniques got more sophisticated. So you'd start with wireframe 3D models, then went on to flat shaded, single color across an entire triangle, and then sort of blending the color across, and then starting to look at lighting, and then texture mapping, which is putting an image over the polygons, environment mapping, which is the same sort of thing but slightly tweaked so it looks like things could be reflective, and always increasing the number of polygons. And that was in the 90s, it was quite common to call out, like these two screenshots here, exactly how many polygons are in whatever they are that are rendering. It wasn't only 3D, there were 2D effects as well, because you had a frame buffer, which is basically an area of memory that represented what was on screen. So you could manipulate that memory. You could do sort of kaleidoscope-like effects by feeding back the current frame on screen and use that to generate the next one. You could do texture distortion type of things, where you would say, have a big array that said, right, when you render this pixel, go to this place in the texture. And you could do things like tunnels and all these other trippy effects. You could even use 2D effects to create textures for use in your 3D engine. And the bottom right hand screenshot there has got a number of objects moving in 3D, but what's on the objects has been rendered in 2D ahead of time and then put on. Even though you only had 256 colours, there were ways to fake true colour by replicating the red, green and blue scan lines on the monitor with proper pixels. So that was quite common too, in calling out, the bottom left screenshot there, calling out the number of colours that they were displaying on screen. So the early demos were very much look what I can do. There was very little sort of artistic style and direction. I mean, it's not quite true for me to say that. The early demo scene on any platform is usually about proving the technology. The Amiga scene and the C64 scene, because they were older, had already sort of matured into the more artistic style and direction phase. But on the PC, which is the side I'm familiar with, that started to happen around the mid-90s. So I'm going to show, and say a prayer to the Wi-Fi gods, some YouTube videos. So these are little clips from, this is from the same team, 3 consecutive years. So quite a typical soundtrack, sort of upbeat electronic type stuff, showing things that are traditionally quite hard to do, like real-time rendering of fractals. There will be no doubt some random 3D objects thrown in, or some lines. This is quite typical. This is the following year. So we've got some image distortion. and again. So it goes on. But towards the end of this one, there's very little relationship between Bill Gates and, say, a teacup. And there's even less relationship between Bill Gates, a teacup, and a duck. But what they're showing here is that you can smash a duck into a teacup and have them overlap correctly. And that was actually a really hard thing to do back then. And people watching that at the time would have gone, "Wow, a duck in a teacup! Oh my God, this is amazing!" And that was kind of like their signature effect that then led into the credits. Oops. But the next year, they teamed up with another group and created something that was more of an art form. There was a consistent style to it. You've got this sort of dark, sort of purple tinged palette that exists through the entire demo. You've got a soundtrack that is no longer, upbeat and electronic. It's now downbeat and electronic. The guy who wrote this music goes by the name of June. He still produces music now. So this one is, again, sort of typical, hey, we've made a 3D engine, but now they're doing something with the 3D engine rather than just showing the 3D engine by itself. So let's talk about music. So music on the PC back then was about MIDI and the standard set of instruments, and everything sounded basically the same. But music on the PC scene followed what the Amiga had done, because the Amiga had this hardware mixing of 4 channels of audio, and so you had music software known as trackers, which looked like, not so much like this one, but you've got 4 channels there, and you basically specify what you want playing out of each channel at each point in time. So this is on the Amiga. You had the software, supplied, and it's very, very common. On the PC, it didn't exist. So the Demoscene groups actually made their own software to do the music. So that's Screen Tracker 3, one of the earlier ones. Another Demoscene group made this one, which looks a lot more like the Amiga software at the time. And what you've got is you've got individual channels. You can see notes on the left in each channel. You would say the note, the sample. So you digitize samples, and it would play each sample in the note you specified. And you could specify the volume, and you could specify an effect like pitch bend and panning and all this sort of stuff. This is one by an Australian who was saddened by Screen Tracker no longer being in development, decided to write his own from scratch in assembly language. And you can still get this around. These are all sort of free. This one's gone open source now. Now, I said earlier that the PC didn't really have the specialised hardware that the Amiga and C64 did. However, this thing needs to be called out, because this was a sound card that was released by a Canadian company that's sort of best known for its joysticks and stuff. And this brought 32 channels of hardware mixing to the PC. Holy shit. Let's skip through. So yeah, the Demoscene loved it because they could, free up CPU for all their effects. Okay, so Windows coming along was a disaster for the Demoscene, because Windows is there to stop you accessing the hardware directly, and demos were always about direct hardware access. So towards the end of the DOS heyday, you had various trends like generating an insane amount of content in a small amount of space. This is 64K, and it generates basically a 5-minute long music video out of a 64 kilobyte executable. You also had real-time ray tracing coming in. This was sort of like the headline effect of the late 90s, because ray tracing was for static images only, and you'd leave your computer generating one for hours overnight. So this was doing it in real time. This one here was probably the pinnacle of the software ray tracing. So you can see all the reflections and the lighting and everything. Hardware acceleration was another big transition for the scene. Suddenly the thousands of hours that had gone into tuning these 3D engines was now obsolete. And so there was a real mixed response to it. People didn't like it. They saw it as low effort and lame to use 3D acceleration. But eventually people came on board and adjusted their code and got used to it. I mean, this is one of the earlier 3D accelerated ones. It's done as a tribute to Miles Davis, so I think it passed away around that time. This one here by German group Farbrosch was, I think, about a quarter of an hour long demo in 64K. Unfortunately, I need to skip through them. Some groups decide to go with a more gritty and very stylized approach rather than something where sort of graphic art was more to the fore than just hardcore techno side of things. So after that, the scene went into a bit of a decline. 3D acceleration was starting to become more popular. There may have been other... the problem with 3D at the time was that it was very inflexible. You basically could say, I want to render a triangle here with this texture, and that's about it. So there wasn't a lot of room to do all the tweaks and cool shit. And also things like Counter-Strike and people playing games online instead of coding demos might have been a factor as well. This intro here, 177K, pretty much killed it for the 3D fly-through style, because no one could hope to match it in the next few years. The next year, the top two voted demos at the same party were 2D based. This is an advert for one of the first big American demo scenes, Demoscene in 2008. This is one big SVG file, and it's basically playing the SVG file in sequence. You can open up that SVG file and zoom in and see all these bits. This one here by, I think it's a largely French group called Andromeda Software Development. They go for very stylistic demos. This one's sort of got an Art Deco sort of feel to it. Unfortunately, YouTube butchers a lot of the detail in these. So, 2007, video hardware had improved to the point where it was usable as sort of a general purpose processor, and it had got to the point where it was fast enough that you could do real-time ray tracing on the graphics card itself, or a variant of it called ray marching, which is sort of a more general purpose form. And so you had these demos coming out that were doing these very sort of curved surfaces and fractals and stuff, but done in real time and all this awesome shading. And you could do it in an incredibly small amount of space. Like the two outside ones are 4K, the one in the middle is 1K, and these are all up around the 3 or 4 minute mark, all with music. So ray marching got more sophisticated. The other thing is people figured out how to do particle systems on the GPU, so you could throw millions of particles per frame at it and get them moving in interesting ways. So these next couple of demos are done purely just out of particles, just dots moving in 3D, which you can then sort of affect in different ways. This one here by the same group the following year took that engine and extended it into doing real-time fluid dynamics, which prior to this was, really only present in high-end video rendering packages, and it is a very offline style process. Which mention Nexi. So this has all been done in real time, modelling the viscosity and tension between individual particles of water and then rendering it as a fluid. And last but not least, the old school was still around. People are still developing demos for the Commodore 64, the Amiga, and the old consoles. This is a demo released 4 years ago now for the Sega Mega Drive for the 25th anniversary of that console. And they are pushing the hardware further and further every year, especially when you look at the Commodore 64 demos and what those are achieving now. So, unfortunately the answer to this question is no. But thank you everyone. If I can get a room tomorrow, if everyone wants to see the videos that I had lined up for some amazing recent demos, please come along. Please choose my talk when I stick it up on the wall. And thank you.